The air was thick with the weight of anticipation, a quiet hum hanging over the racing track. It was early morning, just before the sun's first light could break through the horizon, and everything felt suspended in time. The racing world had its own rhythm, one that was dictated by the pulse of hooves on dirt, the cheer of the crowd, and the flickering seconds before a race began. To most, it was the familiar routine of competition, the adrenaline rush of betting on a winner, the thrill of horses sprinting toward the finish line. For others, like Ethan Walker, it was far more than that. Ethan was a seasoned trainer with years of experience under his belt. His hands were rough from years of guiding horses through the grueling demands of training and competition. His face, sun-weathered and lined with time, spoke of long hours spent on the racetrack. Yet there was something different about today, a sense that the course of his life, and perhaps the world of racing itself, was about to shift. He had come to the racetrack with a singular goal: to find Pegasus, a horse who had once been a champion but now was lost to the world of racing, vanished from the spotlight and, for a time, forgotten by all except those who truly understood the bond between horse and rider. It was a story Ethan never thought he would be part of. Yet here he was, navigating through the complexities of an animal's life, a life that would lead him to a place he hadn't expected, where the world of racing blurred with the world of compassion. Ethan wasn't a sentimental man, but the disappearance of Pegasus had stirred something in him he couldn't quite shake. Racing was about victory, money, and glory, but it was also about the horses, the ones who carried the dreams of those who rode them and the dreams of those who placed their bets. Pegasus was more than just a horse. He was a living being who had once captured the world's heart. Now, Ethan had to find him, not just for the sake of the racetrack, but for something deeper, something unspoken that only the true caretakers of these animals would understand. The morning light was just beginning to creep over the horizon, casting a gentle glow across the field. Ethan stood at the edge of the track, the place where the magic happened. The quiet was almost reverent, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the day's first race. Ethan was not alone in his anticipation. Behind him, the bustling of trainers, stable hands, and jockeys began to intensify. The world of racing was a never-ending cycle, but today it felt different. It felt like the beginning of something larger than just a single race. Ethan had spent years focusing on winning, on training horses to be the best, on taking them to the pinnacle of competition. But he had grown weary of it, and perhaps he had grown numb to the deeper aspects of the animals he trained. That was before he met Leslie, the rancher who had taken Pegasus into her care. At first, Ethan had been skeptical. She had taken Pegasus from the track, believing the horse deserved more than the life of constant competition and pressure. For Ethan, it was an affront to the world he had worked so hard to build. But as time passed, something about Leslie's devotion to Pegasus began to resonate with him. The way she spoke of the horse, the tenderness she showed. Ethan had never seen anything like it. He had seen countless horses over the years, but none had captured his attention like Pegasus had. Leslie had shown him a side of racing he had long since forgotten, what it truly meant to care for a horse beyond the race itself. This was not just about training and glory anymore. This was about a connection that transcended the racetrack. As the day wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging thought that had settled in his chest. Finding Pegasus was more than a mission. It was a chance to discover something he'd been missing all along. Maybe, just maybe, the pursuit of victory wasn't everything. Maybe there was something deeper in this journey, a bond between trainer and animal, between man and beast, that was worth more than any trophy or win. Ethan didn't have all the answers, but he knew that finding Pegasus was the first step towards something bigger. The horses were led onto the track, their hooves scraping against the dirt in perfect rhythm. Ethan stood for a moment, watching them, lost in thought. His eyes briefly flickered to the stables in the distance. He wondered if Pegasus was out there, somewhere beyond the reach of the track, waiting for the right moment to return. But that was not just a matter of finding a horse. It was a matter of reconciling the racing world with a new understanding. A world where the horses could be both champions and something more, something worthy of love and care. The race was about to begin, and Ethan knew that his pursuit of Pegasus would change him, just as it had already begun to change the lives of those who cared for the horse. With a deep breath, he turned and made his way toward the stables, the setting sun casting a warm glow over everything, as if the world itself was offering its own encouragement. Today was the day Ethan Walker began to understand that the journey was not just about winning the race, but about finding what truly mattered in the world of racing. Ethan's feet crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the stables, each step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. He could hear the low murmurs of the stable hands preparing for the morning feed, the sound of hooves stamping on the dirt floor, and the quiet whinnying of horses in the distance. But none of that mattered right now. In his mind, the only thing that mattered was Pegasus, finding him and bringing him back. When Ethan reached the stable, his eyes immediately sought out the familiar shapes of the horses lined up in their stalls. He moved past them quickly, his breath quickening as he approached the last stall at the far end. There, standing quietly, was the horse he had been searching for, the one he had raised and trained, the one who had once been a star on the track. But Pegasus was different now. The once powerful horse that had commanded the attention of racegoers and media alike stood quietly, his head low and eyes cast downward. He was far from the spirited champion Ethan remembered. It was as if the fire had been drained from him, replaced by an uncertain calm that was foreign to the trainer. Leslie was standing nearby, brushing down another horse. She had clearly heard Ethan's approach, and when he stepped into view, she turned, her eyes meeting his with a look that spoke volumes. There was no animosity, no anger, just quiet understanding. "You found him," Leslie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she feared speaking too loudly would disturb the fragile peace that seemed to surround Pegasus now. Ethan swallowed, trying to push past the tightness in his chest. "I didn't expect him to look like this," he said, his voice betraying the confusion he felt. The horse's condition wasn't bad, but there was a distinct lack of the energy that had once defined him. Pegasus seemed off balance, almost withdrawn. It was as if being removed from the racetrack had left him uncertain, unsure of what his purpose was anymore. Leslie stepped closer to Pegasus, her hands gentle as she placed them on the horse's neck, her fingers running through his coat. She didn't say anything at first, but the bond between them was clear. The way she moved with him, the way he responded to her, was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Pegasus seemed to recognize her, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice, his eyes following her every movement. "You've really made a home for him here," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice softer now, almost reluctant. Leslie's gaze remained fixed on the horse. "I didn't just make a home for him, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I gave him something he'd been missing, peace. The peace he needed to find himself again." There was something in her words that stung. Ethan was used to talking about horses in terms of racing, training, winning. He had never thought about what they needed beyond that, what they needed to feel whole. But as he stood there, watching the quiet bond between Leslie and Pegasus, it was impossible to ignore the truth. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, as Ethan tried to make sense of the growing conflict in his chest. On one hand, Pegasus was a prize horse, his potential a goldmine that could bring Ethan back to the top of the racing world. On the other hand, Leslie had given him something that racing never could. She had given Pegasus a sense of belonging, a life outside the track. Ethan's eyes flickered back to Pegasus. He could feel the conflict rising in him. He had come here to take the horse back to the track, to restart the career that had once made Pegasus a legend. But now, he wasn't sure. The horse had changed, and so had he. What was right? What was best for Pegasus? Leslie's next words only deepened the uncertainty that gnawed at him. "I know why you're here," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "But you have to understand, Pegasus isn't just a horse anymore. He's a part of me. I won't let him go back to that life." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Her words were firm, resolute. There was no room for negotiation in her voice. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the conflict wasn't just between him and Leslie. It was a conflict within himself, a clash between the world he had known, the world of racing, and a new understanding of what it meant to care for a horse, to treat them not as a means to an end but as a living, breathing soul. The realization hit him like a freight train, and for the first time, Ethan wasn't sure where he stood. Days passed, and the tension between Ethan and Leslie remained like an unspoken weight in the air. The ranch, once a peaceful sanctuary, had become a battleground of sorts, where every glance exchanged between them seemed to hold the promise of a decision neither of them was ready to make. Pegasus had unknowingly become the axis around which their lives turned, a silent witness to a growing emotional rift that neither of them fully understood. Ethan, though he had returned to the stable daily to check on Pegasus, found himself distracted, his thoughts no longer consumed by the pursuit of trophies or glory. He watched Leslie interact with the horse, and each time, something within him shifted. The way she spoke to Pegasus, the softness in her hands as they brushed through his mane, the quiet moments when she would simply stand by his side. There was a bond between them that Ethan couldn't ignore. It wasn't just affection. It was deeper. It was trust. A trust he had never allowed himself to fully comprehend. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the stable, Ethan found himself alone with Pegasus in the barn. The horse was resting, his head low, eyes half closed as he chewed on some hay. Ethan approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the hay-covered floor. For a moment, he just watched the horse, reflecting on everything that had led him here. Leslie had gone to the far side of the ranch to attend to some of the other animals, leaving Ethan and Pegasus alone. It was a rare opportunity to reflect, to truly see the horse in a way he hadn't before. As he moved closer, Pegasus lifted his head, his large eyes locking onto Ethan's. There was no fear, no uncertainty in his gaze, only a quiet recognition, as though he, too, had begun to understand that his world was changing. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Look at you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "You've changed, haven't you?" It was an odd thing for Ethan to say, considering he had spent so much of his life shaping Pegasus into a champion. But now, as he stood there, he saw the difference. It wasn't just in Pegasus's behavior or his quiet composure. It was in his eyes, in the way he seemed at peace, free from the pressure of the race track, free from the expectations that had once defined him. Ethan knelt down slowly, lowering himself to Pegasus's level. The horse's nostrils flared slightly, but there was no tension in his body. The bond between them, once built on dominance and discipline, had shifted. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about understanding. And for the first time, Ethan felt that understanding, that connection, deep within him. "I see it now," Ethan whispered, his hand gently resting on Pegasus's neck. "I see what Leslie has been doing for you. She's been giving you the one thing I never could. Peace. A life. A choice." As he sat there, his fingers tracing the horse's coat, Ethan felt a sense of guilt wash over him. He had been so focused on the racetrack, on winning, that he had never considered what Pegasus needed, what Pegasus wanted. It was a realization that shook him to his core. How many horses had he pushed too far? How many had he failed to truly understand? From the other side of the barn, Leslie's voice broke the silence. "I think he likes you more than he lets on," she said with a soft smile, appearing at the doorway. Ethan stood up, brushing off his hands. He felt a sense of warmth spread through him at her words. They both knew that Pegasus had a way of keeping his distance from most people, but there was something in his eyes now that told Ethan he wasn't alone in this. He wasn't alone in understanding the horse. "I'm starting to see that," Ethan said quietly, his eyes not leaving Pegasus for a moment. Leslie stepped forward, her gaze softening as she joined Ethan by the horse's side. Together, they stood in the quiet, watching the horse, letting the moment stretch between them. No words were needed. Ethan knew that this bond, this unspoken understanding between the three of them, was something rare, something worth fighting for. Not just for Pegasus, but for himself too. The days that followed felt like a constant tug-of-war inside Ethan. The decisions he had to make were no longer as simple as choosing between the racetrack and Pegasus's future. They were about his own beliefs, his values, and the way he had lived his life for so long. Everything was shifting, but Ethan felt stuck in the middle, caught between what he had always known and what was now being asked of him. It was late one night when the weight of the internal struggle hit him hardest. Ethan had spent the day at the stable, watching Pegasus as he trained, but something in the horse's movements was different. Pegasus was moving more freely now, his stride more confident, as if he no longer carried the same weight of pressure that had always burdened him before. And yet, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging thought that the horse wasn't fully himself. There was a part of him, somewhere deep within, that wasn't ready to let go of the track, that wasn't ready to give up on the glory, the wins, the recognition. Ethan sat in his truck outside the stable, staring out at the dimly lit barn, lost in thought. The cool night air filtered through the cracked window, but it did little to clear his mind. He had always believed in hard work, in pushing through, in doing whatever it took to succeed. But now, success felt hollow. It was no longer about the wins, the races, the applause of the crowd. It was about something deeper, something he had spent his life avoiding. Connection. The bond between him, Leslie, and Pegasus was something he hadn't been prepared for. It was something he couldn't control or quantify, and that terrified him. Why is this so hard? Ethan muttered to himself, his fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. I should just stick to what I know. Take Pegasus back to the track. It's what we do. It's who we are. But even as he said it, the words sounded hollow. He knew, deep down, that what he was saying didn't feel right. He had convinced himself for so long that Pegasus was just a racehorse, that his worth was defined by his ability to run and win. But now, after everything that had unfolded, after watching Leslie care for Pegasus, after seeing the quiet strength in the horse's eyes, Ethan couldn't help but feel that he had been wrong. He had been blinded by his own ambition, his own desire to succeed, and in doing so, he had failed to see what truly mattered. The image of Pegasus standing calmly by Leslie, their shared moments of peace, haunted him. It wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about Leslie, too. She had shown him a side of Pegasus that Ethan hadn't been able to access. She had allowed him to see the horse not just as an athlete, but as a living being with emotions, needs, and desires. And if he were honest with himself, Leslie had begun to show him a side of himself he hadn't been ready to confront. His own need for connection, for peace. Ethan's hand clenched around the steering wheel as the weight of the decision bore down on him. He could feel the pull to go back to what he knew, to return to the racetrack and continue the life he had built. A life of competition, of expectations, of high stakes. But every time he imagined Pegasus in the spotlight again, the image felt less like a triumph and more like a betrayal. I can't do it, Ethan whispered, the words finally spilling from him. I can't put him back in that world. Not like this. Not after everything we've been through. But that admission didn't come without its own cost. The realization that he couldn't continue down the same path made him feel lost, adrift. What would happen if he stepped away from racing altogether? Would it destroy everything he had worked for? Could he really live with the idea of walking away from his career and focusing on something as uncertain as this bond with Leslie and Pegasus? For the first time in years, Ethan questioned his purpose. He wasn't just questioning his relationship with Pegasus. He was questioning everything. His identity, his future, his very sense of self. The internal war raged on, pulling him in two opposite directions, one toward the safety and certainty of the track, the other toward something unknown, something real, something that demanded more of him than he had ever given before. He sat there, in the quiet darkness of the night, unable to move forward, but also unable to return to where he had been. His thoughts circled, each one more tangled than the last, until the faint sound of footsteps interrupted his reverie. Leslie was walking toward him, her figure slowly taking shape in the dim light from the stable. Ethan didn't need to say a word. She could see the turmoil in his eyes, the weight of the decision he had been carrying. I don't know what to do, Ethan said, his voice low and raw. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Everything I've known. It's not enough anymore. Leslie stepped closer, her presence a quiet comfort. Without saying anything, she simply stood beside him, offering him a silent support. It wasn't the answers he needed, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, Ethan allowed himself to admit that he didn't have to have all the answers right now. The morning light filtered through the stable doors, casting a warm glow over the familiar surroundings. Pegasus stood in his stall, calm and composed, his glossy coat gleaming in the soft light. Leslie was brushing him gently, humming a quiet tune under her breath as she worked. The rhythmic sound of the brush swishing through the horse's mane was almost meditative, a peaceful contrast to the storm that had raged inside Ethan's mind for days. Ethan stood at the edge of the stable, watching them. His heart felt lighter than it had in weeks, though the decision he had made still loomed large in his mind. He had spent countless hours weighing the cost of letting go of the racing world, of stepping away from everything he had ever known. But as he stood there, watching Leslie and Pegasus, he knew he had made the right choice. The quiet realization had settled in over the past few days. Pegasus was more than just a racehorse. He was a symbol of something Ethan had long overlooked: the importance of connection, of nurturing relationships, of living for more than just a trophy or a victory. And Leslie, her selfless love for the horse, her unwavering belief in what was right for him, had shown Ethan what it truly meant to care for something, to put someone else's well-being above personal ambition. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, breaking the silence as he stepped forward. Leslie turned her head, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "About what?" she asked, her voice warm, inviting. Ethan took a deep breath, the words coming more easily now than they ever had before. "About Pegasus," he began, his voice steady. "And about everything that's been happening. I think I was wrong. I've been so focused on what I wanted, on the success and the wins, that I lost sight of what really matters." Leslie's eyes softened, and she nodded in understanding. "It's hard, isn't it?" she said quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Letting go of what you think you're supposed to want." Ethan glanced down at the ground, the weight of his words settling in. "I've spent so much time thinking about my career, about the track. I convinced myself it was everything I needed. But watching you with Pegasus, watching him, seeing how much more he is than just a racehorse, I realized I was blind to what really matters." He paused, looking up to meet Leslie's gaze. "I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner." Leslie stepped closer, her expression soft and reassuring. "You're here now," she said gently, reaching out to place a hand on his arm. "That's what matters." Ethan nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I want Pegasus to have the chance to be himself, to live the life he deserves. And I want to be part of that. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I want to be there for him. For both of you." Leslie's smile deepened, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt truly at peace. It wasn't about the races anymore. It wasn't about being the best. It was about creating a life where Pegasus and Leslie could thrive, where Ethan could finally find balance between his ambitions and the relationships that truly mattered. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Leslie said, her voice comforting. "We'll figure it out together. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present." Ethan nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The pressure that had weighed on him for so long began to lift, replaced by something lighter. Hope, maybe, or the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're on the right path, even if it's uncertain. Pegasus wasn't just a horse to be trained or a prize to be won. He was a living being with his own story, his own needs, and his own place in the world. And Ethan was finally ready to honor that. In the days that followed, Ethan worked alongside Leslie, learning to see Pegasus not through the lens of competition, but through the lens of care. The stable became a place of connection, of collaboration, where Ethan and Leslie discussed Pegasus's needs, his temperament, and the future they would build together for him. Ethan no longer viewed the track as an escape from the challenges of life, but as a place where Pegasus could continue to shine, on his terms, surrounded by the people who truly cared for him. As time went on, Ethan's perspective shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to understand that growth didn't always come from winning or achieving. It came from understanding, from making compromises, and from embracing the unexpected. His relationship with Leslie grew stronger as well, not because of what they had to offer each other, but because of what they were willing to give up in order to move forward together. One afternoon, as they stood by the stable watching Pegasus graze peacefully in the field, Leslie turned to Ethan, her expression full of contentment. "You've changed, you know," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, a quiet sense of pride in his heart. "I think I'm finally starting to see things clearly." Leslie smiled, her gaze shifting back to Pegasus, who was now running across the field, his mane flowing freely in the wind. "And so is he," she said. Ethan watched the horse, his heart swelling with gratitude. This wasn't the life he had expected, but it was the one he needed. A life of compromise, of understanding, and, most importantly, of connection. And as he stood there with Leslie, watching Pegasus run without restraint, he realized that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that come from growth, from change, and from the quiet bonds that hold us together. The day had arrived. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation and nerves. It was the day of Pegasus's final race, the one that would determine not just his future, but also the future of everything that had come to pass in the last few months. Ethan stood near the track, watching as Pegasus was led out of the stables, his majestic figure moving with a quiet grace, as if he knew what was at stake. But Ethan, for the first time in his career, wasn't focused on the outcome of the race itself. His gaze was fixed on the bond between him and the horse, the connection that had grown far beyond the confines of the track. Beside him, Leslie stood quietly, her presence a calm reassurance. She hadn't left Pegasus's side for days, making sure that the horse felt the support he needed before stepping into the arena once more. Ethan had offered her a place in the stands, but Leslie had insisted on staying by the horse, the way she always had, grounded, steady, and ever-present. She knew that Pegasus wasn't just a contender in this race. He was a reflection of the journey they had all taken together. The crowd was beginning to gather, their voices rising in a low hum of excitement. The stalls were filled with trainers, owners, and fans, all eager to see the final showdown. But as the announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, it wasn't the usual thrill of competition that filled Ethan's heart. It was a deeper, more profound feeling. Pegasus wasn't just a racehorse to him anymore. He had become a symbol of what true partnership meant: trust, sacrifice, and understanding. Ethan looked down at the saddle, his fingers running over the familiar leather. He had always relied on the rush of adrenaline, the fierce need to win, but today it was different. Today, his heart wasn't set on the victory that would come with crossing the finish line first. Instead, it was about giving Pegasus the freedom to be himself, to run with joy, to run with all of his spirit, without the weight of expectations holding him back. This wasn't about winning. It was about Pegasus running for the pure love of it. Leslie placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "He's ready," she said softly, her eyes meeting Ethan's. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze. A knowing, a belief that no matter the outcome of the race, this moment would mark a turning point for all of them. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, he is." As the gates opened and the horses lined up at the starting line, Ethan took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as if he, too, were preparing for the race. Pegasus stood at the front of the pack, his ears perked, eyes sharp, but there was no trace of the anxiety that had once gripped him before a race. This was different. This was a race for himself, not for a title. The starting bell rang, and the horses surged forward, their hooves pounding against the dirt, the crowd erupting in a frenzy of cheers. Ethan's heart raced in time with Pegasus's stride, but unlike before, the tension in his chest had melted away. There was no longer a sense of urgency, no overwhelming desire to dominate the race. Instead, it was a shared rhythm between man and animal, a harmony that neither could have found alone. Through the turns and the stretches, Pegasus moved with a fluidity that Ethan hadn't seen in him before. No tightness, no hesitation, just pure, unbridled joy. Every stride seemed to carry a weightless freedom, a joy that came from within. Pegasus wasn't just racing. He was living, breathing, and experiencing the moment in its entirety. And Ethan? He was right there with him, matching every movement, every breath. Leslie watched from the side, her heart swelling with pride. She knew Pegasus had found his stride, but it was more than just physical. It was emotional. It was as if the bond between them had been sealed, solidified by the understanding that had blossomed over the past months. As the finish line came into view, the other horses were in full stride, but Pegasus was still holding his own. The crowd was on the edge of their seats, their eyes locked on the race, but Ethan's attention wasn't on the others. It was on Pegasus, on the way the horse's muscles rippled beneath the sunlight, on the way he stretched his body with ease, free from the tension that once held him back. In the final moments, Pegasus pushed forward, his body leaning into the wind, a flash of power and grace. The race was closing, and Pegasus surged ahead, crossing the finish line with an effortless speed that left the other competitors trailing behind. The crowd exploded in applause, but Ethan barely heard them. The roar of the audience, the cheers, the clamor of victory, it all seemed distant. What mattered was that Pegasus had run as he was meant to run. Not for the race, not for the title, but for the joy of being free. Leslie was already moving toward the track, her face alight with a smile that could have outshone the sun. Ethan dismounted and met her in the middle of the track, where they stood together, watching as Pegasus slowed to a trot, his head lowered in satisfaction. For the first time, Ethan felt no need to rush, no urgency to grab the next win. There was only the present, only the understanding that the bond between them and with Pegasus had been forged in the most authentic of ways. As Pegasus reached them, he stopped, his dark eyes meeting theirs, and in that moment, it was clear. This race was more than just about the victory. It was the culmination of a journey, one of understanding, of growth, of true connection. And though the crowd celebrated around them, Ethan, Leslie, and Pegasus shared in a quiet, unspoken victory of their own. They had found their way. The days following the race were quieter than the bustling energy of the racetrack. In many ways, life had slowed down for Ethan, Leslie, and Pegasus, but it wasn't a feeling of stagnation. It was the calm after a storm, one of renewal, peace, and the promise of something new. Ethan had never imagined his life would look like this. A few months ago, he had been single-minded in his pursuit of success, driven by the need to win, to prove himself in a world that had always expected more from him. But now, as he walked through the stables, watching Pegasus and the other horses being tended to, he realized how much had shifted within him. His definition of success had transformed. It wasn't about trophies anymore. It wasn't about the race or the applause of the crowd. The victories now resided in the little moments, like watching Pegasus trot peacefully around the field, or seeing Leslie smile as she worked with the horses. It was about relationships, the connection between a man and the animals he cared for, the bond of trust and respect that had grown between him and Leslie. The success that had once been defined by competition had now become something richer, something more meaningful. Leslie, too, had changed. Her time at the racetrack had deepened her own understanding of what mattered. She had always loved Pegasus. It had always been about him. But now, she found herself looking beyond the familiar walls of the ranch, seeing the world through a lens of possibilities she hadn't considered before. As she and Ethan began talking more about the future, it became clear they shared a common vision, one where horses, like Pegasus, could find a life that wasn't defined solely by the racetrack. There was potential to create a space where animals could be valued for who they were, not just for what they could do. Together, they discussed opening a sanctuary of sorts, where horses who had been cast aside or forgotten could be given a second chance. A place that blended the peacefulness of the ranch with the vitality of the racing world, where the animals would not just be trained, but nurtured, allowed to roam free, and to discover their true purpose. It wasn't just about saving horses, it was about giving them a future, one where they were understood, not exploited. Ethan had been hesitant at first. His life had always been tied to the racetrack, to winning, to the fast-paced demands of the sport. But as he spent more time with Leslie and watched Pegasus thrive in an environment that allowed him to be himself, Ethan began to see how much more fulfilling this new path could be. The idea of combining the resources of the ranch with the world of racing wasn't just practical, it felt right. The notion of using their platform to help other horses, like Pegasus, made him feel like he was contributing to something larger than himself. It was a way to leave a lasting legacy, not just in the sport, but in the lives of the animals they cared for. The partnership between Ethan and Leslie grew stronger, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. They learned from each other, discovering new ways to approach their shared goals, both professionally and personally. Their communication was open, honest, and filled with the same care they had extended to Pegasus. It was clear that they had become more than just partners in the racing world. They had become partners in life. What had started as an unspoken connection over a shared love for an animal had blossomed into something deeper, something lasting. As for Pegasus, he continued to thrive. The changes in him were evident. The tension that had once clouded his racing performances was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that could only come from knowing he was cared for, that he was loved not just for what he could do, but for who he was. His runs were effortless, graceful, and filled with joy, a joy that radiated from his every movement. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ethan, Leslie, and Pegasus stood together in the open field, watching the world settle into twilight. The ranch, the stables, the city beyond. It all seemed to fade into the background. In that moment, there was only the three of them, standing side by side, connected by more than just their shared experiences. They were part of something larger now, a journey that had only just begun. "Look at him go," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with contentment. Pegasus was running freely across the wide-open field, his mane streaming in the wind, his body strong and graceful, completely in his element. Leslie smiled, her gaze following the horse. "He's found his place," she said, her voice full of pride. "And so have we." Ethan nodded, a sense of peace settling in his chest. "Yeah, we all have." In the distance, the sun set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The world was quiet, peaceful, and filled with potential. There were still challenges ahead, of course. There would be moments of doubt, setbacks, and struggles. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel the weight of those challenges bearing down on him. Instead, he felt light, free. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain, but full of promise. As Pegasus galloped across the horizon, Ethan and Leslie stood together, their hearts full, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as a team. The journey was far from over, but it was a journey they were ready to take, one step at a time, one stride at a time. This was their new beginning. The journey of Ethan, Leslie, and Pegasus shows us that true growth comes from understanding, compassion, and sometimes, from the toughest decisions. Their story reminds us that life is about more than winning. It's about finding balance and cherishing the bonds that shape us. If you've been inspired by this story, reflect on the relationships in your life and ask yourself, how can you nurture the connections that truly matter? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this journey resonates with you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with others who may need a reminder of the importance of love, understanding, and change. Subscribe for more heartfelt tales that touch the soul and encourage us all to live authentically.